It's because I'm obsessed with Neil's book. And I'm obsessed with it on a number of levels. So Neil was a very prestigious, accomplished journalist. And after grappling with a cancer diagnosis, decided to take this walk from DC to New York. And what this book accomplishes is the following. One is it's historical because Neil picked out some well-known and some almost unknown historical spots to stop at. But it is a ramble in the sense that he also left space and time to meet and talk to whoever he happened to come across. And it was his own personal journey of reconnecting to life, really. And you finish this book, and there are so many reasons today for us to feel pessimistic and sad and frustrated that everything right is wrong and gone. And Neil, in American Ramble, reminds us that that's not necessarily true, that the bulk of us are still like normal people, putting one foot in front of the other with a good swell of kindness about us. So, I am a bookseller, so I'm going to consider you mighty but few. Not only do you need to buy the book, you need to let everybody you know they need to buy the book. You need to remember this is the perfect graduation present, Father's Day present, Mother's Day present for you. I want this book on the bestseller list. Now, last night, Neil did not an event as prestigious as this. He did the 92nd Street Y with Maureen Dowd. And then comes here, and tomorrow and tonight he's driving back to Delaware tonight because CBS Sunday Morning is going to be at his house. So we are very lucky, and I am extremely grateful that Neil honored his commitment to schlep up here and be with us. So I'd like you to give him a round of applause that defies your number of people. Yeah. Take care.
She had actually said at one point that everyone on the planet should buy the book. Yeah. And I was like, I did the math. I was like, wow, it's like 0.5% of everyone on the planet bought the book. It'd be like the best-selling book of all time. So I'm going to be humble about that. I do want to make a small confession, which is a person who wrote a book about slow movement, close observation, walking, etc. I drove here. And I came from New York, where last night when I did this event, I walked to that event from across Central Park, which means that I had context in between where we have an apartment on the Upper West Side and where I did this event on the Upper East Side. And in this case, I drove all the way here, what would it have been, 110 miles or something like that. I learned just shockingly little on the way here. I was pleased to see that I was taking a left on Boston Post Road, which told me something. And I was on the Post Road several times south of New York, which was all one continuum. But it just strikes me that when we do this thing that we call driving, we arrive in these places without any background on what it is that where it is that we're arriving. And the one thing that's a little hard to convey is just the profound difference between walking a landscape and driving it. And even if you were to go to Pennsylvania because you had an interest in Civil War battlefield sites, and you wanted to do Pennsylvania, Gettysburg, go down into Maryland, go down into Virginia, and drove to a whole bunch of them. You don't really arrive at the same place as the walker arrives at that place, having walked there. And the difference between the sort of richness of the experience and the lack of richness of the driving experience. I like to say to people on the walk that they were, one is 20 times faster than the other, 3 miles versus 60 miles. But the one is hundreds of times richer. And there was a funny dynamic that took place after a while where as me, the walker, and by the way, and I'm going to get back to start at the beginning, kind of more about why I actually did this, but I'd be walking along a road, and I knew that the people driving by me, and there was many times I was walking along roads where the cars were streaming past me, and I'm sure they had a certain sense of pity for the poor schlub on the road who didn't evidently have a car, therefore he was walking. But as the days went by, I had kind of an increasing degree of pity for them and a kind of disassociation between my world and their world, cognizant of the fact that those were humans in the car, but not that interested beyond that, outside of just making sure they didn't run me over. And I think it's almost kind of the attitude that I imagine deer or animals having along the roadside, that they see these things as a menace, but other than that, they're not particularly interested in them because they don't necessarily seem to have sentient beings in them, as far as you can tell. I'm just going to describe briefly kind of the purpose of the walk, and then I'll just maybe talk about some of the highlights of the way. And I do want to have a bit of a conversation because I'm sure everyone has things they might be interested in asking. The book itself, or as I should say, the walk itself, started out as a kind of a little bit of a challenge to myself, or almost a joke, where one day, this was several years ago, I live just east of the US Capitol. I've lived there for more than 20 years. And I thought, what if I just went from my house and, more in a kind of beeline fashion, tried to just walk to New York to see how the pedestrian would fit into that landscape that's so dominated by Interstate 95 or the Acela and all of that. And that kind of original thought, which stuck in my head, is like, God, maybe I should try to do that, but when am I going to find the time, and what route would I take? Became kind of an obsession, where I started to study how George Washington had made the trip when he went to his inauguration, and how the travelers in general traveled, and what the postal routes were, for that matter, and where were the bridges, where did the ferries operate. And I started to read a lot of the early travel logs of people who had made that trip, going back, to the early 1800s. And all of it kind of created a certain mindset where, as it built, I decided, I'm going to do this, but I'm going to do it in a way where I don't try to do it swiftly, but instead do it most meaningfully, in a way that I would go to where the stories were, and the kind of richness of our past was to be found in the most clear fashion. So I devised a route that went up across the Mason-Dixon line into Pennsylvania to York, which is a very interesting town, across the Susquehanna into Lancaster. And I realized that I had to devise a path that went through Lancaster County, because this was a place of such kind of ongoing experimentation with the Amish and the Mennonites being there and pursuing a traditional way of life, some of them that goes back to the early 1500s, and that held a lot of promise. And then there were aspects of the route where, the subtitle is The Walk of Memory and Renewal. A lot of the memory aspect wasn't so much my memories as much as it was that sort of national memory. And when and how do we decide to honor certain people, give them a statue, name things after them, and, or for that matter, when do we decide to memorialize a place? And so I went out of my way to go to Valley Forge, for instance, which was a great example of an series of events, one particular winter during the Revolutionary War, when the Continental Army was at wit's end and really was almost destined to lose to the British. But things turned around, and of course the outcome was different. But it took us basically 100 years to actually care about that winter and that site, and to kind of codify this thing, which in most of our minds now is, invoked when we say Valley Forge. Most of us have some at least concept of what that is, and that phenomena I thought was really interesting. So the walk had so many magical moments about it, and one of the, just to go to the kind of guiding principle with which I walked out my door, outside of wanting to go kind of look at the story in between my house and New York City in a way that Alexis de Tocqueville or these various wanderers from the early part of our country's creation had done, where they traveled and tried to make some sense of this place, that I would go with that sort of sensibility in my head, and not as if I'd already seen it 1,000 times, not as if I was sort of bored in advance by this place that we race across by car or train, but granting myself the license to be astonished and filled with wonder by the things that I would encounter. And then I think outside of that, my main mission was to just really pay attention. Maybe, I wonder if there's even some value. I write a little bit about some of the, well, I don't know these things very well marked necessarily. So it was that attentiveness, I think, that was what part of what kind of set the stage for the encounters that I ended up having with a lot of people. And the third chapter of the book is called The Parables, and it was actually just oddly enough the second day of my walk where I began to have a series of encounters that had the kind of dimensions of what a parable has, which is a one-off encounter between one person and another that has some larger sort of symbolic meaning that if you tell somebody about it, they say, wow. And there was a series of those where I thought, wow, so you go out on a walk, and as long as you have a certain openness to what your encounter with people in particular, things can happen that speak to a larger theme. And one of the funnier parables of that day was what I ended up calling the parable of the empty water bottle, where I was walking through this subdivision outside of Baltimore, and I'd run out of water, and it was these huge houses in a newly developed place that had been a farm 15 years before. And this young man was coming down his drive, and I stopped and I said, do you happen to know where I can get some water? And he said, he thought about it for a minute, and then he said, well, if you go, and he gave me these long and involved directions that I would have to go back about 2 miles to get to a convenience store where I would find some water. And I said, oh yeah, okay, I don't really feel like doing that. So I said, well, thank you anyway. And I started walking. He said, oh, by the way, I just want to say you should be careful going through here. And I said, I don't, be careful of what? And he said, well, a lot of people in this neighborhood aren't necessarily going to understand why you're here. And I just wanted to warn you that there could be some suspicion. And so I ended up telling him a story about this guy who at the moment is walking from like the Horn of Africa to Tierra del Fuego. He's a writer for National Geographic. His name is Paul Solopek. And when he went across the country of Georgia, 54 days, every night, the people in Georgia, wherever he was, would see him walking in the day, and they would say, can we feed you dinner? And he would be put up in people's houses. And so I told this guy that story, and he said, and I said, that's why I sometimes wonder a little bit about us. And he said, yeah, I wonder a little bit about us too. So anyway, when I ended up wandering off, and in the book, I ended up writing about sort of the concept of hospitality and how it is that various cultures had put at the core of their concept of hospitality, how you treat the stranger coming down the road, and how, we have done a very good job of turning our concept of hospitality over to an industry, essentially, we call the hospitality industry. And Uber and Airbnb and the whole thing is, we do stay in people's houses, which is what we do through Airbnb now. So the punchline of that particular parable was that I ended up filling my water jug at a Dunkin' Donuts that I found about 2 miles further down the road. So there was a lot of one of the things that I dig into a lot in the book is kind of walking into these like tectonic moments where a shift is sort of underway in our appreciation of those people's appreciation of people from the past. And one of the things that was so interesting about when I walked out my door, I was originally planning, I had a very elaborate fixed plan to leave on the 29th of March of 2020. And we all had our March 2020 experiences. And we all personally watched our little worlds blow up in a variety of ways. And my version was I had this thing planned and I was kind of sticking to it through like the middle of the month. And then as things that I was intending to do became impossible, kind of one after the other, that this place that I was going to go to was closing, or these people that I was going to see no longer wanted to see me. I realized, like everybody, we were like, okay, this is a different moment. So I had to shut it all down, and I ended up deciding I was just going to do it on the exact same day a year later. And, that was really one of the most extraordinary stretches, I think, in most of our lifetimes between those two marches, where we had this pandemic come across. I had lost a number of parents of my friends died. New York, anyway, we all know what happened with the pandemic, the whole fight over the vaccines, the George Floyd death, the protests, the statues tearing down statues in a variety of places, the whole debate over the nature of our history and our past, the disputed election, disputed in some people's minds anyway. I live 9 blocks from the Capitol. I actually went up there on the 6th of January and watched all that stuff unfold. I didn't go inside the Capitol, but I was watching it literally from the outside. And when I left, I walked into a world that was so dramatically different than what I would have walked into if I done it under normal circumstances the year before, with so many big subjects to think about. And just to cite one example, I came into the city of Lancaster, which had the claim to fame where the first, and at that point only up until Biden's election, Pennsylvania-born President James Buchanan, who's on most people's lists at the bottom of the list of decent presidents. And he happens to have been the last president before the outbreak of the Civil War. And he was a Pennsylvania sort of northern, southern sympathizing, they called them doughface, that kind of outlook. And he was a contemporary of another person by the name of Thaddeus Stevens, who some of you might be aware of, who was really one of the true greats at that period in our history. It was in some ways Abraham Lincoln's conscience, because he really pushed Lincoln to go forward with the Emancipation Proclamation, pushed Lincoln to admit blacks into the military during the war when it was still happening, was very instrumental in the crafting of the amendments after the end of the Civil War, that a lot of us call the second founding. It was a remaking of so many of the principles that the country lives by. But in Lancaster, they were just at that time debating taking James Buchanan's name off one of the elementary schools, and they were just beginning the rehabilitation of the house that Thaddeus Stevens had lived in, while James Buchanan's house, during all the time since he had died, had been meticulously looked after and was, a place that everybody visited. And it was a fascinating thing because these men had lived in that town at the same time. They were really on opposite ends of the moral spectrum. They had died within 2 months of one another and 3 years after the end of the Civil War. And it was only now in recent times that Thaddeus Stevens is sort of coming into his moment. And it's that kind of give and take and push and pull that is an interesting dynamic that we're all watching play out now. And it was something that I poked at quite a bit in the book and in the walk, which is in part kind of going out of my way to unearth some people or bring them more into the light that are more deserving of respect and some element of acclaim. I think the last thing I'll talk about a little bit before we just open it up is I guess it was more the kind of personal element to this. I was, people ask often, what surprised you most about the walk in terms of your own experience? And I think in some ways, the element that surprised me the most was the effect it had on me as the days kind of went by, that I took to be kind of an accumulative effect of walking, thinking, examining the unfolding of the spring in a way I had never had before, without listening to anything, music, podcast, whatever in my ear. I never indulged in any distraction for the sake of distraction. And that combined with just the hyper simplicity of what I was doing, I had 16 pounds or so on my back. I was staying in, simple lodgings along the way. I had a destination every day that was really all I was really sort of doing that day, was to go to that next place. Things would happen in the meantime, but I started to have these moments of kind of joy, spontaneous joy that came sometimes sort of bursting out of nowhere. And there were almost like kind of moments of rapture. And they were, anyway, it was quite an experience, an amazing thing. And there was one of the kind of main moments like that came at the end. There's a chapter in the book called Rapture on the Bayonne Bridge, which, yeah, exactly. Yeah. They're like, what? How could that possibly be? The place where most people are cursing their existence. But I had a really hilarious experience. So I sort of devised my route going up that part up from Philadelphia into New York itself, based on how the colonials essentially had gone, because that area that we now call the Meadowlands south of there was and still is largely swamp-ish area. So I was fascinated by the fact that everybody, if you know this geography well, would go up to the mouth of the Raritan River and across the Perth Amboy, and then they would go across to Staten Island, and then they would go the length of Staten Island, and then they would go across the Kilbunkle to what is now Bayonne, and they would go up to what they used to call Paulus Hook, which is an old Dutch settlement, but we now call Jersey City, and then they would go across by ferry from there to Manhattan. And that actually was the route that George Washington, for instance, had taken for his inauguration. So that was also the route I took. And it was the best route to take anyway. But I'd had a really funny experience when finding places to stay was not easy. Because you realize when you're walking that even if you're in a really crowded part of the country, lodging is almost always concentrated around like exits on interstates, and even like in Perth Amboy, there's no hotel, there's no lodging of any kind in the town of Perth Amboy itself. It's all, like 5 miles away along the interstate. So, and 5 miles, you sort of learn when you're walking is an hour and a half, right? Or whatever. It's not the 5 minutes that it is in a car. 5 miles is nothing, right? So when I was leaving Perth Amboy, I had to find a place to stay at the top of Staten Island, and there was like nowhere that came up on orbits. And I kept looking around, and then I found this place that was called the Victorian B&B, and I called the number, and this woman answered with a Polish accent, and she said, "Oh yeah, I have room. I can give you a room for $100 and $110 a night." And when I arrived there, it was her house, and she was this Polish immigrant who had fled Poland in the 70s. She hadn't had a guest for a month and a half. The minute I walked in the door, she said that she was gonna do my laundry and she'd already made dinner for me. And, she turned her B&B into, as I was doing, like a bed, laundry, dinner, breakfast, and every other sort of thing. She was just sort of overjoyed to have me there. And we had some hilarious conversations. And the next morning, when I came downstairs with my backpack, she was waiting there, like jangling her keys, and she said, "I'm going to drive you to the Bayonne Bridge." And I said, "Danuta, I'm here. I'm walking. This is a walking trip." And she said, "No, I insist on driving you because it's a scroungy area between here and there, and I want you to skip that." And so finally, I gave in to her, and I threw my backpack into her car. And Danuta was 81 or something like that. And when I got to the bridge, she let me off. I thanked her. And when I was walking towards the bridge, she rolled down her window. I was wearing these shorts, and I was like, and she rolled down the window, and her last words to me were, "You have really great legs." Which is not what I was expecting. So, setting off from there, I then was walking up the incline of the ramp to go over the bridge. And I'm just going to read this little bit to describe kind of what happened. And it will give a little bit of the sense of kind of the accumulative effect of the walk itself. As I went day after day, opening myself to the people and places I encountered, I became in tune, more open to those people and places, more in tune, more in sync, as Ted had predicted in his driveway on that third morning of the walk. Absent the otherworldly distractions buried in our phones or laptops, I could feel my capacity for awe and wonder grow exponentially with the days. All I came to care about was what I saw around me, the people I met, the little shifts in culture or barn design, the texture of the land I crossed, the nuances of the forests or the farms. I tried to care about that with all the energies usually spent on caring about more distant and abstract things. It was, I suppose, an effort to grant preeminence to place, to make the present truly immediate, to have it stripped as much as possible of all unnecessary mediation, to have attention, as the good poet said, be the beginning of devotion. Perhaps that helps explain why, when I stepped out onto the initial incline, going up the huge sweep of the Bayonne Bridge, the sight of the Manhattan skyline hit me with a physical force. I hadn't been looking for the city. I had my eyes at my feet. I was thinking of other things. Then I raised my head while walking the up ramp, the wind coming strong and bracing from the north, and the sudden sight of the city's jagged towers and the sparkle of the river above the Richmond rooftops washed over me like an ocean wave. This weird rapture went beyond mere gratification. I had seen this skyline before. 1,000 times over the years, I had caught sight of it from all directions as a cab driver and a common traveler. But on this morning, the sight of it physically astonished and stunned me. The days and all those steps had pried open a part of the human spirit that magnifies the potency of otherwise simple things and grants the commonplace a touch of the divine.
Wow.
Thank you. Should we just talk? Yeah.
Oh, what was that woman? Oh, I didn't even not raise my hand.
Oh, yeah, no, no, raise that.
Read up.
I think she was like, 81, something like that. She was really, really funny and kind of great. And, from a book writing point of view, there were so many amazing lucky moments that came along where like that chunk of the book would be sort of impoverished had she not existed. And there she was, and she like brings that portion of the whole walk and the book to life. And those were magical things. Yeah.
The person you encountered in the driveway when you needed the water,
Yeah.
how old, and did he know what you were doing? And no offer to just
I know.
Fill your water? I mean, what's it, did he have any notion of like your purpose going through his neighborhood?
I mean, I said I was on a walk to New York and, and he said, and the funny thing, I don't think I said this to you, that he said, when I started to leave, he said, you remember when I said, be careful?
Yeah.
I wasn't suggesting that I was suspicious of you.
Yeah, right.
Because you look like a perfectly decent person. I was just telling you that other people might be suspicious of you.
How about some water, pal?
Yeah, a lot of people have said you should go out of your way to go by the house and drop the book off and just put a little bit so you can read all this. But again, he was actually a really helpful. He was in his 30s, I think, young. And he was, I think, more than anything, just kind of oblivious in a funny way. He wasn't being mean. I think he just was being dumb. But it's funny because before that, I arrived at this nursery. And I said before about the fables, but there was this like little moment where I thought, oh my God, I can't start to become like a kind of angry prophet on this walk. But I'd come into this nursery where they were growing all these pallets of flowers, and it was early spring, so these were about to go to Lowe's and Home Depot and everything. And it was greenhouses that were meticulously watering all these flowers. And I saw a guy who worked there in a golf cart. I said, can I get some water somewhere? He said, yeah, there's a water jug right up there in that trailer. So I was walking towards it, and I suddenly heard this woman say, may I help you? And I said, yeah, I'm just going to get some water out of the water jug there. And she said, what are you doing here? I said, I'm on my way walking through. And she said, you can't be here. And I said, well, I was just going to get some water here. And she said, you can't be here. You have to leave right now. And I said, why did you ask if you could help me then? Why did you say, may I help you? And she said, you really have to go. And then I said, well, I'm trying to clarify. I can't get water, but you're watering all these flowers right here. And then she actually called the guy off to like leave me off the property. But I had so many acts of kindness from so many people along the way that those were among the few that were at all like that in that sort of school. Yeah.
How often or did you go through any trails, like nature trails, or just off the grid kind of places?
I mean, the only times I did that was there's a lot of great rail trails where the old railroads have been turned into trails. So there's one that I walked up from the border of the Maryland border from a town called Railroad, and it was actually the original rail bed of one of the first railroads built in the country, which is like 1832.
Wow.
And which is something I was quite fascinated by, because I talked, a lot of the book is about time and how we try to understand it and don't really understand. I don't know if any of you, there's a great story in the New York Times today about how astronomers saw something that they'd never really seen before, which is a star basically engulfing a planet, like way, way, way out in the galaxy. And they were talking about how this gives some clarity to what's going to happen to us. That they think it's about 5 billion years from now that the sun will just have this explosion that will just gobble up the planets around it. And I was like, wow, that's amazing. And 5 billion years, we're all fine. But the railroad was the thing that really upset our sense of time, and really it was the first time in our evolution that we weren't going 12 or 14 miles an hour. We were going 30, 35, 40, 50 miles an hour.
Wow.
And horses don't really cross that much more territory than humans do over a given day. I mean, you can walk 30 miles in a day. A horse is going to take you similar sort of distance by a lot. So your question though, so outside of doing that, and then a few times when I walked along canal paths, like when I was along the Delaware, I walked for a good part of the day down the Delaware on the canal paths, which is beautiful. But my point was to be where our history was and the people where this was not an Appalachian Trail kind of thing.
Right.
Yeah.
Did you feel much better when you worked with people?
No, I actually, I had so many great encounters with people. I mean, one quick story I'll tell is, when I was in, the Mennonite area, walking through Lancaster County, I was walking up this road and I came to this school and I glanced over and I saw this young woman, girl, she was 8th grade, who was standing in this playground with a very long floral dress on and like a head bonnet and a baseball mitt on. And I heard then this whack of the baseball bat, and she backed up and caught this fly ball. And I was like, what? And I went into the playground and there were these 2 games of softball going on where all the girls were dressed like that. And they, when they finished, they all came over with their teacher. They were really fascinated that I was there. And I started to talk to them about my walk and some of my observations. And then one of the girls stepped forward and she said to her teacher, Mr. Weaver, could we sing for Mr. King? And they invited me into the school, into the basement, and they got on the risers and they sang these 2 unbelievable songs, which were these hymns of the afterlife that someone in their community had written, and they're incredible singers. This sort of like 3-part harmony and all this stuff. And I forged a friendship with them so that I've been back several times. I was there 2 weeks ago for a big event at that same school where there were like 200 of the parents and kids came, and it was just me and them, wasn't like open to the public, and they sang for 25 minutes, and it was, so that was one of the things that was so fascinating by the walk is, you kind of break out of your regular rounds, go up and do something like this, and I formed all these bonds with all these people through the course of 26 days, which is sort of an unusual thing for any of us to do.
Tell me what the logistics of it. What time would it, start in the morning and then end at night?
Yeah, so one thing I did along the way, I knew by the time I walked out the door that I was going to do a book, and I decided that I would write increments, not of the book, but just record every day as I went, by writing an account of it and sending it out to 250 or so people on email. So I was always staying in some sort of place. I wasn't camping out. So I'd found Airbnbs in various places. And I, averaged about 14 miles a day, but some days, the first few days were over 20 each day. And I would usually be fairly wiped out. So I would usually go to bed by 10:30 or so. And I almost always woke up by like 5. And I would spend the first 3 hours writing by the day before. And I would send the thing out, and then I would go out, usually around 8 or so. And then, if you have 14 miles to walk, you can get 9 of it out of the way, in the first 3 hours of the day. And by 11 or so, you only have to do, whatever, 3 or 4.
It's late March though, so how's the weather?
We always think, well, of course, it's different here, a little bit different, but we always think of March as being like particularly blustery or cold. There was one day when there was like a little bit of snow, but for the most part, it was warm, and I was really lucky on the rain. I only got really rained on about 3 times, and that can be really difficult. April can be really serious when it comes to like sustained rainstorms. So that was a good thing. The weather never like knocked me, aside or delayed me in any way.
So you've been hiking a long time.
Yeah, I mean, this wasn't like a huge athletic feat. I didn't really look at it as that so much. I mean, I bet most people in the room could do some version, but you get stronger as you go. So
How long? was
you're
your
skeptical.
training?
I spent 26 days.
26 days?
Yeah.
That's all.
Yeah, and that included a few nights where I spent like 3 nights in Philadelphia. Where I was just doing some stuff there, but I wasn't like covering this like large distances. Yeah.
Please.
No.
Did- I may be completely wrong about this, but did Tommy Lee Jones play Thaddeus Stevens?
He did.
And did that have anything to do with this resurgence in interest?
It might have helped a little bit because it was in the movie Lincoln.
Because I mean, he was so compelling.
Yeah.
And that's, I mean, I've read a good deal of history, but that's the only time that name has really made an impression on me. And it reminds me a little bit of McCullough's book about John Adams.
Yeah.
A lot of people sort of forgotten about them, and then suddenly,
I know.
you know, and
I know.
I just don't know if there's anything there.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting. There's another guy that I went and paid a lot of attention to, a guy named Benjamin Lay, who was really fascinating. Like hunchback dwarf, they called him. He was like 4 foot tall, and he was like this really obnoxious Quaker guy who was in everybody's face about giving up slavery. And he was like so aggressive in the tactics that he pursued, and so that they banished him from most of the Quaker meeting houses, and he became somewhat of an outcast. But just before he died, the Quakers in 1760 something, I forgot the exact date, they renounced slavery as a religious order. They gave, because they, then William Penn had slavery. And he was just a real kind of crank, but in the best sort of way. And it's only been in the last 4 or 5 years that the meeting house that he was a part of north of Philadelphia has put his name on a grave there. And they put a plaque out on the road. And somebody just wrote a really good biography of Benjamin Lay. And so he's now kind of having a real moment, which he definitely deserves.
Huh.
Yeah.
With when you left your door in DC, you obviously probably had a handful of preconceived notions of what you were going to be doing, but did much of that get blown out of the way on your path to New York City, or did you hold on to some of those things to guide you?
It's obviously not really possible that you walk out your door without any, just like this a completely clear head. Yeah, right, yeah. I kind of attempted to do that as much as possible. So you're asking like what notions I had that were sort of challenged along the way.
Or just got diverted, as finding Danuta,
Right. It was funny. It was a mix of, I call it a ramble, but I guess a ramble would mean that you were just walking in a kind of directionless way, which is certainly not what I was doing. There were kind of rambles built into every day where I had a lot of flexibility to do various things. But I knew very much where I wanted to go. And of course, I had also tried to meet a lot of people along the way, because a lot of the central figures in the book I had arranged in advance to meet, because I couldn't leave it all up to luck. I think this isn't really a preconceived notion or so, but one of the things that I thought was really quite striking is I had never just spent time just watching a spring, like what it's about, and like unfold day by day. And because I was walking north, I was really following the leaf line, right? And so I was constantly in these places where the maples had come out or they hadn't come out yet, and you'd come up a hill and the trees, maybe because of the way they were exposed to the sun, would have flowered, but when you went back down, they wouldn't have flowered. And I was just really astonished by the variability of that kind of thing. And again, it went to the kind of we can go through vast portions of our lives while we're kind of noticing a lot of things out of the corner of our eye. And it's like, oh, it's spring, yeah. Oh wow, it's summer all of a sudden, But this just had such an incremental, closely observed aspect to it that was just really shocking to me. And it kind of drove home how I'd never really taken the time to do that before, Yeah.
I was raised in New Jersey, and part of the reason I was laughing about the rapture on the bank is because of the well-deserved reputation of New Jersey. And if you're on the Upper West Side, the brown strip of Jersey, did you come away with any appreciation for New Jersey that you'd never had, or that people here in Connecticut might be surprised?
Well, it is the case, as that there's a whole beautiful hillish, horsey part of New Jersey that's really quite bucolic. And when I crossed the Delaware, where George Washington did, and I walked up into that part of New Jersey, I was like I had brought a fly rod with me, and I did some fly fishing. Well, it was a very collapsible sort of fly rod. And there was like trout streams along there, and some beautiful horse farms. And I stayed with some people that live in a converted barn to the west of Princeton. And, then I walked from Princeton across to Cranberry, which is right along the along the Jersey Turnpike, where I had a really funny, actually Cranberry is a little bit, maybe like Madison, it's not nearly as well off, I don't think as Madison is, but, it was also right midway between New York and Philadelphia on the postal route, so it was where they would like switch horses and stuff like that. And to the west of the freeway and of the town, it was like meticulously preserved, all these beautiful fields. They've been very diligent about that. And then on the other side were all the like Wayfair and Amazon warehouses and all that
Yep.
kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And then there was and then there was Jersey Turnpike. And I had the most amazing experience there where I met with the sort of town fathers and, historic preservation people. Everybody, there was anybody during the founding period, it all spent the night there in Cranberry. There was all the signs of who slept where and all that kind of stuff. And my plan was to leave the town and go up this brook that went through the woods and then went under the turnpike and between all the warehouses. And then when I told them what I was going to do, this one woman said, "No, you're not going to do that. It's not possible that you can walk up that way. It's just not accessible to it's too boggy." And so she immediately jumped up and called her son, who showed up 10 minutes later, and took me to his house and pulled a kayak from beneath his house. And he said, "Okay, this is what you're going to do." And he laid out this great elaborate thing about how I was going to paddle up and climb over all these various things, where all this wood had fallen and through this swampy area and all that sort of thing. And then once I'd gotten over like 5 of these obstacles, I would have a clean shot of getting under the Jersey Turnpike. And I said, "That's great, Tim. What am I going to do with your kayak?" And he's like, "Oh, don't worry about it. Just leave it. I'll come up at some point and get it. You can leave it along the highway." And that was just like one of these fantastic, again, these things that happened because I got to paddle up a river that had probably changed almost not at all for thousands and thousands of years. Between these warehouses and underneath this turnpike that at that point is 12 lanes wide. And right when I started to go into the tunnel to go under the turnpike, this deer came down on the other side, and it was like perfectly silhouetted. It was one of these amazing. The deer was looking at me like, "What are you doing?" But a lot of it was a kind of tongue-in-cheek interactions with the wilderness of New Jersey. And there's a whole chapter devoted to getting up the Edgeboro landfill, which is in Middlesex County near East Brunswick. And I reached out to these people that run the landfill, and they said, "Sure, we'll take you." I was like, "I really want to summit your landfill." And I wanted to be part of it. And that's where I first saw a tiny outline of Manhattan from the top of the landfill, which was an amazing.
That's dirty.
Yeah, I'm going back there on Monday with the CBS News crew to the landfill. Check it out. So.
You are rambling.
Yes, exactly. The whole thing was really pretty magical.
Were
So,
you ever concerned for your safety?
I wasn't, and the only thing I worried about at all was just some person looking at their phone and swerving and like hitting me by mistake, because I was along, the highway, and I always would walk into traffic, so that you could see something like that. No, not from any other person that was going to do me harm. I had a funny experience where I was in Philadelphia doing an event like this at the Philadelphia Free Library, and there was a guy about my same age, black guy, sitting in the front row, and at the end of the thing, when it got to questions, he stood up and he said, "Neil, I just wanted to ask a question. Did the police ever hassle you, and do you think a black man could do the same thing you did?" And I said, "That's a really interesting question." And I answered basically saying that, my risk is certainly lower than pretty much anybody else's risk. Certainly than a woman or a black man or whatever I come across as a certain way, etc. But if the person, whatever their race or gender, is predisposed to wanting to do a walk like this and thinks that they're good at it and feels that they're skilled at interacting with people along the way, they should do it, and I think they could do it. And they do this kind of stuff all the time. People do all kinds of huge walks around America and elsewhere. And so at the end, when the whole thing ended, the guy came over to me and he introduced himself, and I said, "Oh my God, we had already communicated by email," because he had reached out to me. And the guy had himself walked from Harriet Tubman's birthplace in Maryland all the way to the Canadian border while sort
Oh,
of tracing her steps.
Wow.
And I said, Ken, why did you ask me this question? And he said, oh, I just wanted to see how you would answer it. And I said, how did I answer it? He said, you answered it exactly right. That if you're good at it and feel predisposed to doing it, you're probably going to be okay because you're going to know how to do it, you know. So, which is not to say that the risk is all the same, because it's not, but and this is obviously a bad time to be talking about this because we've seen all this crazy stuff lately, you know, people just shooting someone because they walk up the wrong driveway or something.
Did you ever have a night where you thought, geez, I really don't know where I'm gonna sleep? Is it, or did you know by midday where you were going to?
There were only a few mornings that I woke up where I wasn't sure where I was going to sleep the night before, because you didn't really have that luxury, because you didn't have a lot of choices, and I didn't want to be scrounging around to find a place at 7 at night when I suddenly realized it was, you know, 5 miles away. So for the most part, I would figure that out. Like the bed and breakfast in Staten Island was one of those things I figured out the morning of, and I stayed in some really unpleasant place in Perth Amboy, which I found that day also.
Did you name them in your book?
For
Yeah,
them, I did for the most part. Actually, there's a lot of detail in the book. So, you know, I'm not assuming anybody's going to recreate the walk, but you could pretty much, because it's almost all in the book.
So who is interviewing you for CBS?
There's a woman, Martha Teichner.
Martha Teichner.
Teichner.
She's good.
Yeah, she's really good. Yeah,
That's nice.
yeah,
Look forward to seeing that.
yeah, yeah. So now I know that's, they're working on, I need to spend 3 days with them. Which is going to be quite amazing, starting tomorrow morning.
You have a sequel in mind?
You know, at one point I thought that I should continue, like go from something, the book ends in Central Park. In the Ramble, which is that part of Central Park that is so amazing, right north of the lake. And then I thought, you know, why don't I just do a book where I would go, and I was thinking I'd do it in the winter, maybe it would be kind of intense. And I would continue from there to Walden Pond, you know, which of course, if you did that, the vast majority of the walk would be in Connecticut. Like 3/4 of the walk would be in Connecticut, which 3/4 of my walk was in Pennsylvania.
So the good thing about walking to Walden Pond is you won't have to pay $30 to park.
Yeah, exactly. Is that what it costs?
Yeah,
Wow, $30.
I don't think he would approve of that.
That's amazing.
Disgusting.
Yeah.
In winter?
I know, I have, yeah, I don't think I'm gonna be doing that. I'll have to see if I do that. I'm trying to figure out what my next thing is gonna be.
Well, the spring part of it is really, you know, epiphany there too. That's nice.
The spring part of it is an important part of the book. And I was very lucky about that. And I was also lucky that I walked out the door right when we thought COVID was ending. So it's actually, that spring was somewhat similar to this spring, except it was more kind of ecstatic because we thought it was over, and then it wasn't. Because we had been vaccinated, masks were going away, everything was reopening, and then Delta hit like whatever in like May or something. So it kind of swiped it all back. But
Are you also on Audible?
yeah, I did not, because of my scratchy voice, I did not do the Audible version of it, but that guy did, and he did a really good job of it. Yeah. It's pardon?
No, I was talking to, I said I could get the Audible in by the book.
Oh, yeah, so, yeah, I like that. Should we do the signing stuff?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great, and thanks for your questions. Thanks to everyone for coming tonight. If you'd like to purchase a copy of the book, Neil's signing those afterward. We have copies just at the register down here. We're gonna have Neil signing here, as long as that works for him, then you just make a line here, and if you have other questions, you can ask.
That's great.
Thank you.
Okay.